Hi everyone, welcome to Biogeography Week 13, second to last lecture of the semester. You're almost done. Hang in there. Um, Make sure you go back and read my email that I sent either yesterday or earlier in the week. It's kind of hard to keep track of the days of the week, especially at the end of the semester. But I outline a bunch of updates about the semester coming to a close, assignments that are still outstanding if you have those, and midterm exam corrections and those sorts of things. So make sure you go back and read that email carefully, and then contact me if you need to. As many of you have experienced, things are piling up at the end of the semester. I will grant you the same leeway and sort of grace that I'm trying to grant myself in things piling up, the cases of COVID skyrocketing in many areas, and kind of facing the difficult holiday season ahead, where things have become more precarious for this global pandemic virus that is really affecting us. Okay, and so I hope, say all that to say that I hope that this upcoming break from classes and kind of the routine that we've been in is helpful for you all, and to continue to reach out to each other, check on your family and friends. And I'm going to do my best to kind of get caught up on the things that are still outstanding with respect to this class. As for today's lecture, it's going to be this week's lecture. It's going to be relatively short, so you should be able to get through this relatively quickly and easily. We're coming to the home stretch of the semester, and what I really want to do with these last two lectures is kind of introduce some broad topics, broad issues, and so to get you thinking about like the current state of things, which is maybe not so pleasant a thing to think about. But then to talk about some ways of thinking and strategies and tactics that biogeography and biogeographers have to deal with certain issues. So this week we're going to be talking about wildlife conservation, and this is an area of specialty for me for my own research. So if you're curious about how I approach this, you can look me up online at the faculty website, and there are a bunch of videos and papers and articles and things like that I've written about this topic. And then this week's reading, or I guess next week's reading, is reflection is going to be a podcast episode in which I talk at length about my work on California condors. So it's an opportunity to kind of connect a little bit more personally with me and the work that I do. So I encourage you all to listen to that because it's an assignment, and find out a little bit more about what I do sort of while I'm not in the classroom, a virtual classroom. So when we're thinking about wildlife conservation, and this is a picture of a map of the globe, the projection, of course, is off because Antarctica is not really that big, and most of you know that. But looking at the terrestrial areas of planet Earth, we see that the areas in red are what those of us in the scientific community have called biodiversity hotspots. So areas where there are large concentrations of different species. And many of these species are endemic. You can look at the map and see Madagascar being entirely highlighted because there are a lot of species that are endemic to Madagascar, meaning that they're found nowhere else. And, if you get into wildlife conservation and biodiversity research, these are the areas highlighted in red on this map that your work is going to take place. I also want to point out that you see that there's a big sort of clustering in the Pacific, Polynesia and Micronesia, that are biodiversity hotspots. And this kind of goes back to our discussions about island biogeography and why islands are so important for the understanding of evolutionary processes, endemism, and evolutionary experiments. So it's good to take note of this. Obviously, the Amazon jungle is a area of biodiversity hotspots. We can see certain sub-Saharan Africa areas have lots of biodiversity hotspots. And of course, Southeast Asia is home to many, many unique species. And so it's a good way to kind of understand, where life is most concentrated on planet Earth. So some general principles about what we've been talking about this entire semester and what we know about how life functions, the biogeography of life on this planet. We know that the Earth and, more broadly the universe is a place of constant change. We've been talking about that all semester, and the work of famous biogeographers who've come before us have been able to describe how this change happens, the mechanisms of this change. But we know that the Earth and the universe is always changing, so nothing is constant. So species that don't adapt to the changes that come about for various reasons either adapt or they fail to adapt and they go extinct, as you can see from this drawing of a dinosaur, right? The dinosaurs were not able to adapt to the massive changes that were happening on the planet. And as a result, they went extinct. And, mammals really kind of exploded after that, right? So we know that change is part of this process. We also know that the evolution of new species has facilitated the extinction of other species. There are predators and parasites and, competitors that evolve that put a tremendous amount of pressure on existing species. And if those existing species don't adapt, then they go extinct. And so species, along with these other abiotic factors, are agents of change, right? Homo sapiens have continued to dramatically change ecosystems and ecosystem functions. One example of Homo sapiens facilitating the extinction of a species is with this. This is a moa. It is an extinct large flightless bird, and here is a skeleton of a moa. And these birds are no longer around. They used to inhabit what's now considered New Zealand, or Aotearoa, which is the Maori name for that island archipelago. And so the Maori and Maori people, when they were moving across what's now considered Australia and Tasmania and that part of the world, they, around the time that these people showed up and eventually became indigenous to these lands, scientists have observed the extinction of the moa, this large flightless bird. Okay, and so all of that is within the kind of normal natural history of the planet, right? These large-scale changes that are happening outside of species control, species facilitating the extinction of other species, and then of course human beings facilitating the extinction of other species. But the point I want to drive home is that those changes, those normative changes that have existed for, hundreds of thousands and millions of years on this planet is somewhat different than what we've observed over the last 15,000 years, and particularly over the last 500 years on this planet, with human beings colonizing and impacting the biosphere. And so, this term anti-indigenous civilizations is what I'm talking about. I think it's something that I've tried to make the argument these last couple of weeks as something unique to the biosphere, and something unique to human beings. It's something that human beings have not been practicing. So, every species that impacts its environment is a given. So how species use these resources varies, right? And so for most of our history as a species, hunter-gatherers, our impacts were significant, but they were within this sort of like normal, expected, relatively slow pace of evolution or ecological change, right? And so I show this picture of a person turning a ceramic, looks like it's going to be a vase on a wheel, as an example of how human beings have kind of infected their environment over the past, over most of our history, right? But what we get when we have these anti-indigenous civilizations, these large-scale civilizations that insist on resources that are less interested in compromise and more being in good relation, as many indigenous people talk about. Less interested in investing in the relationships, the ecological, sociological, cultural relationships, but more interested in extracting resources, building material wealth, and disadvantaging other people who have lived outside of those borders. We get a different pace of production. We get a different pace of technology. We get a different pace of waste generation. And so this is a screenshot from the movie some of you may have seen, the sci-fi movie Ex Machina, which is about the creation of artificial intelligence in the near future. And so, this is sort of an analogy of how humans have been living on this planet over the last really 500 years, half millennia. And so we get these very significant non-normative, so not within the history of changes on this planet that species have been doing, alterations. And so we get things like global climate change, right? This is something that's new as it results from a particular species facilitating global climate change. Certainly, global climate change is not, in and of itself, is not new. But the pace and the source of that climate change is something that is new so far as we know as human beings. We see this massive increase in the rate of species extinction. And even in, at the KT boundary 65 million years ago when this meteor struck the Earth, we have not seen the rapid extinction of species that we are seeing right now. And we're in the midst of the sixth global extinction. And again, that's being facilitated primarily by one particular species, Homo sapiens, and not some global or planetary or extraterrestrial catastrophe. And then we see this massive transformation and rapid transformation of global land cover, right? The clear cutting of forests for agriculture, which is happening at a scale that we've never seen on this planet, outside of meteor impacts or these other sorts of events. And so, all of this is part of and central to these anti-indigenous civilizations, these civilizations that do not allow for the people, the human beings, and the other species that have existed for millennia to continue to live in the way that they do, but insist that everyone within the borders and expanding borders of said civilizations change or be liquidated in order to serve the needs of those communities. So something that's very different. So this transition to modernity, what we understand as the modern world, the anti-civilization world, has sort of taken place over the last 15,000 years. We see these large-scale civilizations popping up. These huge cities, this massive increase in human population within those borders and expanding borders. And it's fueled by this wholesale investment in domestication, right? So instead of hunting and gathering, instead of cultivating species with very, very little alteration, we get this massive investment in domesticated food, domesticated animals, and some would argue auto-domestication, the domestication of our species ourselves to fit this new society. And certainly, as I mentioned, within the last 500 years, we get what's called settler colonialism and colonialism, right? So different groups of people moving to different areas, wiping out or trying to wipe out indigenous human cultures, indigenous other species cultures and presence, for their own purposes. So we get these dramatic increases in human population, extinction, both cultural extinction from the human cultures that have been wiped out, species extinction, global climate change, and this curious fact about the way that human metabolic diseases have increased. And by metabolic diseases, talking about things like diabetes, cancer, heart disease, these sorts of things that are the result of these very rapid and strict changes in human diet. Again, this is something that comes from disrupting ecological relationships that have existed with human species and the species that they've lived with for a very long time. So we get rises in obesity, rises in cancer that are present in these anti-indigenous civilizations. Where we look at indigenous civilizations and groupings where people have the sovereignty to eat the food that they've eaten for millennia and to interact in those ways, we don't see those same rates, these epidemic rates of these sorts of diseases. So, I'm saying all this to say that the conversation about how human beings are impacting the planet is actually too generalized, because headlines like this and results of studies like this, looking at humanity has wiped out 60% of animal population since 1970. Well, it's not all of humanity, right? We see these sorts of devastating results as a result of colonialism and settler colonialism. And again, where indigenous people are able to be intact and are not pressured to adopt modern technology, not pressured to adopt all sorts of modern ways or contemporary ways of human beings, then we don't see this type of devastation. But it's when civilizations are either built on liquidating natural resources or they are pressuring other less empowered people to do the same, we get this sort of devastation. So an example from my work that I'm not conducting now, but what I did for my dissertation is here. This is a picture of a municipal dumping ground in Rajasthan, India, which is northwest India. And so if you know anything about the country of India, it's an incredibly diverse and large country. But one of the dominant sort of subcultures within India is based on Hindu religion, where practitioners of, and this is the dominant sort of belief system in India, believe that consuming animal flesh is not something that human beings should be doing, and so they don't. But people still have livestock. And so in countries like the U.S., where we consume the body of our livestock and not just the milk and the fur that they provide, some member of the ecological community has to dispose of those bodies. And so in many parts of rural India, there are these dumping grounds where people bring their livestock to be taken care of by what's in this picture are vultures. And so vultures are really good at cleaning up dead animals, particularly large animals. They're really good at picking the bones clean. And so this has, for thousands of years, been a very important relationship between human populations and bird populations. There are a variety of species of vultures in this picture. Most of them are Egyptian vultures, but there are a couple of others that are there. I took this picture, so this is from my dissertation. And so, once this job is done, there is a particular group of people within Indian society, the lower caste, untouchable class of people, that are tasked with both delivering the recently dead livestock to this dumping ground, and then they're responsible for picking up the cleaned carcasses, and I use cleaned as a relative term, so that they can be further processed for fertilizer. So this, again, is another picture that I took during my dissertation, and it demonstrates the importance of the relationships between human beings and other species, right? And this is a very important thing. And you can imagine that without this service that the vultures provide, the livestock that outnumber human beings in India, and India has over 1 billion human beings living within its borders, all those bodies, all those cow and goat and sheep bodies, pile up really quickly. And so for thousands of years, vultures have done a great job of cleaning that up. But in about the late 80s, early 90s, there was a veterinary drug that was introduced to the market. And it just so happens that that veterinary drug is really detrimental to vultures. And so if you own a cow and your cow gets sick and you give it, this drug, it's called diclofenac, and your livestock that medicine might help the animal or it might not. But if you're a relatively poor peasant farmer, you don't have access to antibiotics, you don't have access to a veterinarian oftentimes, and so this cheap drug is the only thing that you have to give your animal, and it may or may not work. And if it doesn't work, your animal dies, you take it to your cow dies or your goat dies, and you take it to the dumping ground, and the vultures eat that cow or goat. The vultures can't metabolize the drug diclofenac, and it actually gives them visceral gout. Their kidneys can't process it, and so the chemical, when it makes its way through the urinary system of a vulture, it forms crystals. So it's a really awful, painful way for these birds to die. And so this drug being introduced to the market actually resulted in a 90%, sometimes 95% decrease in vulture populations in India. And so when the vultures disappear, dogs take their place. And so, because there's all this food that's available. So this is another picture that I took at this same municipal dumping ground, and there are dogs everywhere here. And, you might think that that's really cute, but these are feral dogs. And so they are sort of like wolves or coyotes, right? They don't really have a sustained relationship with human beings. And so, we were at this site, and my research partner was saying, sort of keeping an eye on the sun and making sure that we got out of there before the sun went down, because this is a very dangerous place to be for a human being walking around. In the daytime, the dogs leave you alone, but at night, you can become fair game to these dogs. And so feral dog populations in India over the last 20 years have really exploded because the vultures are gone and there's less competition for the dogs for this food. So that's a problem. Rabies deaths are really high relative to the rest of the world in India because there's so many dogs and the dog populations are really high. But the other issue with having dogs is that they're not as good at cleaning up the bones and cleaning up the flesh of these dead animals as vultures are. Vultures just have a better tool for picking the bones clean than dogs do. And so it's also dangerous for the human beings who are working in this area, not only because the dogs may attack them, but because disease is a much more prevalent issue. I mean, most of us would not want to be working the job that you see here that these men are doing. But in terms of their exposure to disease, it's only gotten worse because these dogs aren't able to pick off all the fleshy bits of these carcasses, and so their job becomes that much more dangerous. So for me, doing my dissertation work, this is a really important example for ecological relationships and the importance of keeping environments intact, and the ways that the unintended consequences of human societies, particularly anti-indigenous human societies, can have these really large-scale cascading effects on wildlife and human populations as well. So, a couple of more really not so cheery things about, the products of anti-indigenous civilizations. This is a schematic on some of the things that we produce in modern society and how long it takes for these different products to biodegrade on their own, right, if they're not being processed. And so, one of the big worries about how human beings are living is our production of plastic, and that there really isn't there really isn't a good mechanism for the disposal of plastics. And many of you know that plastics are accumulating in the ocean, not only the ones that we can see, but microplastics, and causing lots of issues with our environments. There's a really large, massive body of plastic waste in the Pacific Ocean that's the size of Texas. And so, all of these things that are being produced by a modern society that we simply don't have a good way of disposing of said things, right? So we can look at a plastic bottle, takes 450 years to break down on its own. Fishing line, 600 years. Glass bottle, undetermined amount of time. A disposable diaper, 450 years. Aluminum can, 200 years. A cigarette butt, 1 to 5 years, right? So, these things that we produce and oftentimes don't think about once we've used them up are a big problem, and they're still with us. So, these are really, really important things to consider. So the question becomes, why conserve? What benefit do wild organisms provide, organisms that live outside of these civilizations? And then, the question is, how are decisions about conservation made? How are decisions about wildlife made? What species do we, and we always have to be specific about the we that we're talking about. How do those decisions get made? Do we save polar bears? Which polar bears do we save? Do we save all bears? And then why? Why would we do this? And I think, there are a couple of many different answers to that question, and they're changing. But in general, what benefit do wild organisms provide? I think, it's important to think about disruptions to the ecological community, and the fact that much of or all of the environments that we're born into, that we live into, have existed before we got there, right? And so these are relationships. This is a place that human beings as a species are stepping into relatively recently. Polar bears have been around much longer than we have. Virtually every species that we know of has been around for a much, much longer time than Homo sapiens. And so, we don't always understand those relationships, and it's important for us to show respect to our elder species, to the elder relationships that have existed that we're stepping into. So that's sort of one of the benefits that wild organisms provide. And there are all sorts of ecosystem services that, we often take for granted in modern civilized society. One example would be honeybees and pollinators. And the fact that much of the food that we eat, whether or not that's the food that we eat that eats the food that grows for us, or directly the food that we eat, plant foods, are pollinated for free by other relatives, other organisms that live in these environments, right? And so when we unknowingly or callously or carelessly disrupt those relationships, we ultimately end up making things worse for ourselves. So, the field of conservation is a very new thing. And so, I asked this question, is the field of conservation popular among hunter-gatherers? And the answer to that question is no, it's not. As like a discipline in and of itself, right? And so, it's a big issue for us, what I call civilized folk. And I mean that as in like anti-indigenous civilizations, right? So people living in this boardroom, deciding how much money are we going to spend on conservation? What campaigns are we going to have for saving the whales and polar bears? But amongst the people in the background here, these indigenous groups of people, conservation is not the sort of a separate field that has to be, market analyzed or anything like that. It's much more a part of life. And that's a big contrast. The life ways of many and most indigenous people is intricately tied to the relationships that those people have with their ecological relatives, the species that they live in close proximity with, and that they recognize that fact. Whereas, this picture of this boardroom, there's not a lot of recognition of the other species and the other organisms that undergird that relationship. It's very much an exploitative set of relations. And so that's why, the field of conservation sort of developed. And one has to ask themselves, what are conservationists opposing when we do the work that we do, right? What's ultimately standing in the way of conservation of condors, of conservation of polar bears. And, I think many of you would be able to say, like, oh, well, human greed or wealthy people or, these sorts of things. But all of those are an offshoot of what I think is at the core of anti-indigenous civilizations. It's the mentality and the value system that drives these civilizations, which is, and as many indigenous scholars have talked about and written about, is the idea of severing relationships with other species and just commodifying them and thinking about them of what they can provide for human beings, and not necessarily giving the proper respect and deference to those species. So, I think that it's important when we think about the field of conservation to be thinking more about and to be engaging with indigenous peoples' understandings of relationships with other species. And there's only so much we can do in the boardroom. There's only so much we can do in the classroom. There's only so much we can do with the university system to save these species, especially when we're not really confronting what it means to live in an anti-indigenous civilization. And just as a quick aside, you might be able to tell how old this photo is of the boardroom if you look at the person who's sort of looking to their left and holding their glasses. And if you look at their computer, you can see that some of you may not even recognize that as a computer, but that's what the older laptops used to look like in like the early 2000s. So this is an old photo, and you can tell that by by the laptop. I'm just noticing that. Okay, so within anti-indigenous civilizations, there are different conservation models, and as I mentioned before, these work okay, but none of them are really kind of confronting the fact that these models are coming out of an anti-indigenous civilization. And so they're ultimately limited in what they can do. But I'll talk about these couple of models. The first is the species model of conservation. And so focusing on conserving a specific species. And we see this all the time, these campaigns, save the tigers, save the whales, save the polar bears. And oftentimes it's focused on species that human beings feel really close to or feel really inspired by or activated by. And oftentimes they are species that people from Western European and United Statesian societies decide are important. And the issue with this is that many of these charismatic macrofauna, like the Bengal tiger here, live in areas where there aren't where Western civilizations, Western European and United States civilizations aren't based, right? So oftentimes you have this dynamic of more wealthy and empowered nations telling less modernized, less empowered nations what to do with their wildlife. So there's a tension in this species model oftentimes. Another species model, and you see this more prevalent in Western European and United Statesian societies, is the habitat conservation model. So focusing on preserving an area like the Everglades or the Chesapeake Bay or the Ozarks or what else? The Amazon rainforest, right? And so again, sort of looking at these biodiversity hotspots. But of course, these hotspots occur in the developing world or the global south, and there are all sorts of really difficult power dynamics that exist between the settler colonial nations and the colonial nations, and the nations that are emerging and pushing for their own autonomy and sovereignty. Then there is the preservation model, and this is a photo of John Muir, who is the founding member of the Sierra Club. And so this is sort of focusing on maintaining a habitat exclusive of human presence. And here's a picture of an anti-poaching squad, sort of a paramilitary anti-poaching squad that patrols a park reserve in South Africa. And so, this is the preservation model is sort of the basis for conservation in the United States. And we have exported this model, this sort of like extreme borders, extreme fencing model to other parts of the world. And it's really problematic. It's deeply problematic because, again, it does not allow for the relationships of indigenous people in these environments. And so John Muir is credited with, the establishment of Yosemite National Park and Sequoia National Park. But John Muir was horribly racist and horribly anti-indigenous and advocated for the expulsion of indigenous people from these areas because he thought that they would just ruin things, when in fact settlers, white settlers, were the ones who were going in and severing relationships and not paying attention to the ways that indigenous people had lived for millennia. And then, we also see problems in the global South with paramilitary groups going into places like sub-Saharan Africa and not caring about, the poverty rates of human beings, that indigenous people that are living there. And it's certainly a difficult situation when people are trying to use their land base to make a living and to survive, and to have a colonial power or settler colonial power tell them that they can't interact in the same way. So, the preservation model has created some really wonderful opportunities for the privileged, those who are deemed worthy to access those areas. But it does a really horrible job of being fair to all people and insisting on certain people not belonging. And not surprisingly, those who gets excluded has everything to do with race and power and money and things like that. So lots of conflict between indigenous people and those who are economically more empowered. And so the last conservation model within anti-indigenous civilizations is the coexistence model. And so this is a focus on resolving human-wildlife conflict in order to preserve the humans and the wild species. And so this is a photo that I took during my dissertation. And it's a woman with a young child walking back from a store that's up the road, and a threatened antelope species, a blackbuck antelope, sort of crossing her path. And, again, like the photo that I showed, the photos that I showed earlier with the municipal dumping ground, rural India is a really interesting place to study wildlife, because wildlife and human beings live so close to each other, on top of each other, really. And so, this coexistence model is looking to resolve conflict, not looking to kick people out and shoot people on sight who might wander into those areas, but to try to resolve that issue. But, as I mentioned before, there are limitations to even this coexistence model because of the things that we talked about before, that these anti-indigenous civilizations just produce things that are really bad for the environment. I mean, both of these, the antelope and the human are walking along an asphalt road, which is makes travel between areas really convenient and much faster, but it's awful for the environment, right? These noxious chemicals and this product that lasts however long, hundreds of years, far longer than the species that are there. So, coexistence will only get you so far, just like all of these conservation models will only get you so far in achieving the goal of maintaining wildlife species and maintaining healthy environments for human beings as well. So, the coexistence model is the primary focus of my work. But again, it's limited. It can only take us so far. So, as we close, the take home message for wildlife conservation, and you'll learn about more of that through the podcast and through the next lecture when we talk about it, is that, critical environmental problems are a consequence of anti-indigenous civilizational practices, right? The trash generation, the pollution, the species extinction all result from these civilizations that are really not interested in what relationships have existed before, but interested in, producing things and building wealth for a very few and limited population. So not all humans, live in conflict with their environment, and that's what indigenous people all over the world have told us and showed us. So it's no coincidence that as the global crises, environmental crises have increased, we've seen a decrease in the number of indigenous cultures and peoples and their sovereignty that's been on the planet. So the dynamic of change has happened all the time. What's worrisome about these civilizations is the speed at which things are changing. Right, we are seeing. And the fact that anti-indigenous civilizations are largely unconcerned with the consequences that change brings. It's more so of let's produce it and then we'll figure it out later, rather than is this a good idea? Is this going to disrupt relationships? And so most species, including humans, are not really adapted to rapid change, right? We can think about this with technology. The fact that technology is just increasing exponentially. All you have to do is talk to a parent or a grandparent to realize that human beings are not really well adapted to change in technology. My mother is 78 years old or will be 78 years old in January. And, really struggles to operate a computer. And so, in another 50 years, 60 years, I can't even imagine what the state of technology is going to be. And I imagine that, my children's children, if they decide to have children, are going to be really frustrated with their grandpa for not being able to figure out the technology, right? And so these rapid changes we're not really well adapted to these changes. And we can think about them on an ecological scale. Human beings are, a species that adapted about 250,000 years ago, right? And a lot has happened since then, and most of it we're not really well adapted to deal with. So, can we continue to afford anti-indigenous civilization? Is this way of living sustainable? And I think, many of you would argue, no, it's not. And I would argue the same. So the question becomes, what are we going to do about it? So, the question of the week that I have for you is, how do you feel about the future of humanity on planet Earth? And then why? Why do you feel that way? I think there is a lot to be concerned about. I think there's also things to be hopeful about. So I'm just curious to know how you all feel about the state of things as the next generation of adults, the next generation of people who are going to be making decisions about how we live and what we do and how we meet these challenges. So weigh in on that on the Google form, and I'll be really curious to read those answers and think about things. Just a couple of reminders, and I won't put a slide up, but make sure that if you haven't gotten your midterm exam corrections in, please do submit those. Your reflections for the podcast and the for both podcasts, the podcast and the reading, are due on next Monday, November 30th. So make sure that you finish those assignments, and that due date has been updated on eCampus and the course schedule. So make sure you get those two reflections in. I will post the next podcast for you all to listen to sometime next week, early in the week, and you'll have until December 6th to turn in that reflection. Okay, so giving you all a little bit more time to get stuff in. If you have stuff that's outstanding, please turn it in this coming week. All right. I know it's been really hard to keep up with assignments, so just go back and look at everything that's been assigned on eCampus, and if you haven't turned it in, get it in, please, so that I can get caught up on grades and get stuff done. Okay, so yeah, I hope you all are able to get what rest you can during the fall holiday, and if you're able to see your family safely, friends and family safely, please do. But if it's looking like maybe that might not be the best idea, then please, try to make arrangements so that you all can be safe. The most important thing that we do, especially as winter is coming, is to minimize the spread so that we can get back to life as we knew it in some respects before. This isn't going to end until more people do what we know is right to protect ourselves and to keep each other safe, and so that's really important that we do that in the coming months. All right, talk to you all in 2 weeks, yeah, hope you all have a good and restful break as much as you can.